Qu'est-ce que c'est la sculpture moderne was an important exhibition for 20th century sculpture. We could use another of its scope and high ambition. But I bring it up here because I think its binary framework includes two key missteps. The first is perceptible in where its account of abstraction differs from Clarke's, namely in the lack of space it makes for the frustration of meaning, for the opaqueness of modern sculpture at its most difficult and even rebarbative. Clarke's flatness is at once a figure of metaphor and of resistance to metaphor. That is the intrinsic form of its modernity. It pointedly occupies the space where art declares its apartness from life, playing across and drawing attention to the threshold. The core devices of modern sculpture betrayed an acute consciousness of this threshold. They're already there in Rodin. They are arguably what made his sculpture vivid. The continuous disappearance, reappearance, and integration of the pedestal, the heavily worked surfaces that threaten to collapse into so much material, the activation of the floor and the wall, and the intrusion of everyday subjects, quotidian objects, and ephemeral materials. These devices, taken together, were the form of sculpture's modernity from Rodin onwards. They had to serve as metaphors for modern experiences of space and time, of seeing and knowing and living as a modern subject. But they also had to refuse these metaphors, remaining irreducible to any of them, and holding sculpture in its own liminal space between the real and the illusory. This gives on to the second problem with the framing of Qu'est-ce que c'est la sculpture moderne? Its central dichotomy of art, of culture and nature imagines that the forms of transcendence and embodiment in which modern sculpture engaged can be plotted on a graph. This leaves little room for the deferral, frustration, and multiplicity of meaning that went hand in hand with modern sculpture's means of staking out its place in the world. To put it another way, where does Brancusi's bird in space fit within this binary, or Jean Arp's reliefs, or the surrealist object? In the end, I don't think there's a way around the fact that these practices were all after the absolute, after a kind of order and a way of being in the world that in its seeming timelessness, purity, or sheer otherness seemed to belong outside the established structures of modern life. But those structures and their outsides depended on one another. They were defined against one another. Brancusi's polished bronze surfaces always flirted with the mass-produced article in their pursuit of immateriality and weightlessness. The terms in which Arp understood the human's relationship to the natural world was freighted with artifice, both in the constructedness of his reliefs and the persistent iconography of objects like tools and chairs that actively produce a material and psychological distance from nature. The surrealist objects erotics of everyday life entirely collapses the exhibition's binary on its own. This is a long way of setting out my stall and of saying that at root, the issue with Qu'est-ce que c'est la sculpture moderne is that it asks the wrong question. The only satisfactory answer to the question, what is modern sculpture, is one that tries and inevitably fails to account for its sheer multiplicity. It mires us in the particular. The question we must ask instead is, what does modern sculpture do? How does it act on us and its environment? And how, by extension, is its identity produced? Likewise, what modern sculpture signified matters less than how it signified. For example, the subject of Picasso's Glass of Absinthe shows that modern sculpture was opened up to the trivial, intimate acts of exchange, both social and economic that constitute the stuff of everyday life. The inclusion of a real absinthe spoon, both in the original wax model and every bronze cast, shows how that transience and the lightness and transparency of the liquid absinthe itself was held in tension with the permanence, weight, and opacity that sculpture had always used to ascribe value. How the glass of absinthe signifies is through contradiction, through an ever-deepening antagonism between the world to which sculpture belongs and sculpture's means of belonging, speaking, and addressing itself to that world. Qu'est-ce que c'est la sculpture moderne was far from alone in asking its question. Debates around modern sculpture have frequently failed to mark the distinction between what modern sculpture is and what it does. This is perhaps a mark of art history's slow and highly compromised adjustment to the language of philosophy. But it is surely also because these debates coincided with moments in which the coherence of sculpture as a category seemed to be genuinely under threat, in which definitions seemed necessary for the practice of sculpture to persist in any specific and meaningful task. One such moment took place in the 1960s, when American minimalism came to stress the latent temporality and physicality of sculpture. Minimal sculpture insisted that we address ourselves to the object as a body occupying a physical space and time. By contrast, modernist critics like Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried championed the sculpture of Anthony Caro and David Smith, which they said was premised entirely on its opticality, on the object relinquishing its tactility and weight in favor of a lucidity and spatiality far closer to that of painting. All of this was to elevate the values and identity of sculpture above its procedures. What sculpture was really doing through Smith's industrial practices and Caro's disciplined studies of the terms in which sculpture secured its place in the physical world made a bad joke of any simple dichotomy between the visual and the material. But these examples, not to mention the antagonism at the heart of Picasso's Glass of Absinthe, suggest that questions about what modern sculpture is are also rooted in the processes of modern sculpture itself, processes that conceal themselves and that mark the site of the medium's resistance to language. This is where sculpture and painting do meaningfully diverge, where sculpture's means of acting within the space between what it materially is and what it represents depart from painting's habitual return to the condition of flatness. The tension between illusory depth and real surface has always been written into painting, its theories, methods, and modes of self-reference. Modernist painting merely called upon and exacerbated this tension, opening up a space that could accommodate modernity and its metaphors, including its own nature as a material object. But sculpture's modes of illusion had never truly meant to disguise its belonging to real space. Rather, they had meant to entrench it ever more vividly in that space, in a space it shares with us and a whole world of objects. Modern sculpture made a subject out of the processes that secured this vividness, that both addressed its objects to our attention and set them apart from the world we share. I think we can find something close to these processes in what Jean-Paul Sartre called en soi, or being in itself, and its relationship with pour soi, being for itself. In other words, between non-conscious things and conscious beings, inert objects and active subjects. For Sartre, action and the possibility of change is wholly conditional on the pour soi. It is our perception in the world of things of what Sartre calls nothingness, what we may call lack, absence, or negativity that moves us to act. There is nothing intrinsic in the existence of objects that calls forth such action. For this reason, asking what is the en soi can only ever be an invitation to ask, what is the en soi doing? What and how is it lacking? By way of an example, Sartre describes arriving at a cafe, expecting to see a friend named Pierre and finding him absent. The cafe and its contents, as a result of this disappointed expectation, become a ground without a figure and take on a negative cast. Pierre's absence haunts this cafe, Sartre says, in spite of the fact that Pierre's presence elsewhere and the cafe continue to exist independently of one another. We may likewise say that the real absinthe spoon and Picasso's model glass are each replete in their being. It's through their combination that we may come to identify a lack, the lack of either object to fully cohere in the language of the other's world, the discontinuity between modernity and our available means of capturing it in sculptural form. To say that objects need subjects in this way does not render the world of things trivial or strictly secondary to consciousness as much as Sartre elevates the latter. On the contrary, it is the relationship between them that generates meaning, that constitutes lived experience, that forms the site of negation and contradiction. This is the space in which I want us to see modern sculpture. Its condition can be best understood, I think, as that of apartness. It is at once a part of and apart from ourselves and our world. Its distance, its out-there-ness, its otherness is irreducible. And precisely for that reason, it is tethered to our lived experience. Nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm, Sartre says. It is our subjectivity that awakens it. We can see at once how this idea of the modern sculptural object resonates with artists who shared Sartre's milieu or philosophical grounding. His terms remain essential to understanding the plays of distance, proximity, and scale in Giacometti's figure sculptures, turning other subjects into objects and conferring a heightened materiality on the untraversable space between us. But our histories increasingly treat the inherent otherness of the modernist object as a cause for suspicion. Distance suggests remoteness. Autonomy suggests imperiousness. We have come to think that modern sculpture had a stable set of values to protect, values inherited in essence from the 19th century, not least its value as a commodity proportioned to spaces of private display. We don't want apartness and the compromises it entails. We want an art that surrenders its separateness as the price of a real critique of the institutions, conceptual structures, and politics that it sustains. I think the reality of modern sculpture's apartness and the terms in which it was variously preserved, disrupted, and exacerbated by successive generations of artists is too contradictory and above all human to be dismissed as neatly as this. Apartness was a condition of modern sculpture's capacity to gain purchase on its world. It was perhaps its only imperative. My personal test case for this statement is the work of Brancusi. His sculptures have so often been understood as objects of pure aesthetic contemplation for an implicitly privileged subject. Sculptures so distant from the contradictions of everyday life as to solicit the creation of a separate world in the artist's studio with its own delicate ecology. And yet, the logic of this world was inherently disruptive to the modes of perception and experience that traditionally delimited the field of sculpture. The endless shifting of the positions occupied by its carved pedestals, furniture, and sculptures made it a space of highly provisional and radically non-hierarchical structure. The apparently ideal viewing conditions of the studio were repeatedly figured in an intentionally compromised way in the sculptor's photographs. Obscured in shadow and overexposed, the perspective they offered was highly personal and, above all, marked by transience. Equally, the characteristic reserve of the sculptures and the distance of the studio from the bourgeois world did not foreclose either savage pastiche or the breaking apart of categories that modern life had sought to reify, to make permanent. Brancusi's practice was one of difference and multiplicity that took such categories as much as it took wood, marble, and bronze as its raw materials. And it staked this entire project on the distance and otherness of its objects. Perhaps nowhere within modern sculpture is this central antagonism more clearly demonstrated than in its fragments, in the persistence, rupture, and rationalization of the human form, the subject that had given sculpture its raison d'etre from the beginning. The fragment was, I think, the master symbol of modern sculpture's apartness. And I want to close here by studying how it served to articulate the medium's distance from and reference to us, both as bodies and as subjects. Take a brief drink for this section. Some of the earliest attempts to write modern sculpture into history coincided with the re-evaluation of Rodin. For much of the 20th century, Rodin had been viewed as the last 19th century sculptor in his mastery of the paradigmatic human figure, his command of literary and mythological sources, and his animation of classical bronze and marble. But beginning with a flurry of activity in the early 1960s, Rodin came to be rehabilitated as the first modern. Among these activities were a long essay written by Leo Steinberg for an exhibition of Rodin sculptures and drawings in 1963, as well as a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, curated by Albert Elson that same year. What they shared was a conviction that Rodin's modernity and the basic terms of the modernist object as such could be located in his fragments, that is, his presentation, replication, and manipulation of arms, legs, torsos, and heads, sometimes excerpted from whole figures, sometimes made with reference to only an imagined body. These objects might have seemed to point backwards rather than forwards in time, channeling Rodin's academic training in working from plaster casts and echoing the excavations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that flooded the museums of Paris and Rodin's own collection with ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman sculpture. We heard about this in Astrid's excellent talk yesterday. But Elson made clear that Rodin had not, quote, backed into this century with his eyes focused on the past. Rather, with his fragments, Rodin had, quote, learned to make sculpture from sculpture. Here, Elson meant to set out a contrast between two kinds of tension. First, there were the narrative tensions inherent to the choices made in sculpting a body. Whose body is this? What is it straining towards or away from? Will it succeed, and at what cost? Second, there were purely formal tensions between masses and planes, positive and negative space, stillness and movement, solidity and give. The fragment, in its detachment from a represented subject, an original model, and a moment in narrative time, had collapsed these two forms of tension into one. In this, Elson was following the American sculptor Truman Howe Bartlett, who published a record of his conversations with Rodin and impressions of his practice in the 1890s. In speaking to Bartlett, Rodin claimed that his first fragment was a portrait head he called the broken nose, which had frozen in his unheated atelier and split, leaving only a mask. Rodin told Bartlett that the portrait was, quote, made as a piece of sculpture solely, and without reference to the character of the model as such. The fragment thereby came to represent the concentrated form of Rodin's attempts to make sculpture from sculpture, or as Bartlett puts it, quote, the question of lines, masses, and effects, of drawing his model in the severest sense of the term. The subject as such occupied no place in his mind. It was with him, then and ever afterward, the never-ending and all-imposing problem of planes. It's worth pausing here to observe that this is being said of the sculptor of the gates of hell. It is furthermore being said of a practice that stocked the gates of hell with its grasping, broken bodies through the appropriation of various figures and fragments originally modelled for other projects. The earliest iterations of the self-sufficient modernist object were not only themselves products of mutilation and amputation, but served to represent an infinite profusion and repetition of human suffering. The etiolated figures of Giacometti are on one level already inscribed in this. The sculptural object's distance is from the beginning qualified by metaphors of excessive embodiment, of pain, trauma, and in the famous instance of Paolo and Francesca, desire. 6 years after his MoMA retrospective, Elson set out a history of the entirety of modern sculpture according to the persistence and development of the fragment as a vehicle for pure sculpture. By now he was calling the fragment the partial figure, and that was the name of his exhibition. Through this exhibition, the partial figure, which was held at Baltimore Museum of Art, Elson argued that, quote, repeatedly in this century, sculptors have turned to the partial figure, not for the traditional purposes of religious symbolism, architectural decoration, or mementos of antiquity, but as a means of focusing on what they considered to be essential. For Elson, the fragment offered modern Western sculpture a means of escaping from the figure, the pedestal, the whole network of relations encompassed by its production and reception prior to Rodin. The fragment was how sculpture became an object, how it came to internalize its condition as an en soi, shrugging off everything but the perpetual present in which it was cradled. And yet, even on these terms, Elson's partial figure retained its connection to the body and its world. Elson's exhibition was divided into 4 sections that traced a line from Rodin through pre-war avant-garde, interwar surrealist and post-war sculpture. In each case, sculpture's ability to secure its independence, its being in itself, seemed to furnish its capacity to speak more directly to the experience and complexity of modern bodies. Violence remained a central metaphor, be it the violence of labour, or by 1914, still remember 3 years before Rodin died, the violence of mechanised conflict. Henri Gaudier-Bjejka's Man Fallen from a Scaffold gave form to the sculptor's memory of an accident witnessed in the streets of Paris, while also drawing out the robust, taut modernity he saw coursing through the body of Rodin's John the Baptist. A beggar, Gaudier-Bjejka said, who walks along, who speaks and gesticulates. He belongs to my own time, is in my epoch. He has a 20th century workman's body, just as I see it and know it. Gaudier's workman would not look out of place, straining to extricate itself from the surging materiality that forms the ground for the relief panels in the gates of hell. There is no reason why the fall he represents should be any more prosaic. The same may be said for Jacob Epstein's hybrid of human and machine rock drill. The literal amputation and symbolic castration enacted by Epstein when he dismounted the figure from its pneumatic paving stone breaker and cast its torso in bronze inevitably called to mind another grim dialectic between modernity and its objects. By 1915, thousands of amputees were already being produced by the First World War, as were new forms of metal prosthetics. Other expressions of the growing proximity of the organic and mechanical retained a greater degree of their dynamism and force than Epstein's shorn drill operator. But they never truly promised to resolve the contradiction. In fact, they built quite literal nothingness, what Archipenko called the void, into the physical structure of the body, just as Epstein's torso protected a coiled up fetus. In different ways, these presences and absences were all expressions of lack, of pure indeterminacy and potential. They ask questions about the coherence and identity of the body that were being posed for the first time. The rock drill's embryonic core highlights the frequency with which these questions revolved around sexual difference and the fragment's capacity to figure and refigure its logic. As Anna Chave has shown especially well, Brancusi's partial figures were always about difference. They speak the language of metaphor, metonymy, and analogy, and the ways in which gender inscribes the forms of a body are essential to these terms of reference. The phallic outlines of the otherwise androgynous torso of a young man and the specifically feminine portrait bust to Princessa X serve to fold the binary structures of gendered form in upon themselves. Their surfaces, when cast in bronze and polished to a high finish, also fold in the viewer and their environment, so that the play of identities within the object also becomes a play of presence and distance from the object. None of this is to say that the partial figure failed to gender its bodies or to enact its implicit violence upon the female body. Elson boldly named one of the 4 parts of his exhibition Sex and Sadism in the Entre-deux-Guerres. This included the de-eroticized geological bodies of Henry Moore and the linear drawings in space of Julio González. But it also harbored the explicit mutilations of Giacometti's Woman with Her Throat Cut and the fetishism of Hans Bellmer's doll. We are some way here from the practice of making sculpture from sculpture. We're closer to Lyndon Knocklin's conceptualization of the fragment as a body in pieces, where the disarticulation and violent breakup of the body, rather than intimation of either a lost or new kind of wholeness, is inscribed in its parts. The Woman with Her Throat Cut was designed to be laid across the floor without a plinth to mediate its separate reality. Bellmer photographed his dolls in domestic settings and against the backdrop of dense forests. Our distance from these sculptures is measured entirely in our position as subjects relative to an object of desire. The violence inflicted on those objects functions in 2 ways. First, it is a performance of transgression, a negation of the pristine social and superhuman bodies imagined by fascism in its grotesque version of antiquity that was spreading across Europe in the 1930s. And second, these acts of violence signify as an excess of nothingness, the playing out of a lack, and with it repression, anxiety, and self-hatred upon the other. They should leave us in no doubt that real bodies and their politics had always been at stake in the way modern sculpture carved out its place in the visual world. Remarkably, Elson's transition to the post-war era is unmarked by the rupture of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the concentrationary universe, by the absolute violence and industrialized death of the camps, and what they promised for the future of both the human body and the human condition. To understand the amputation and fragility of the partial figure as an expression of trauma, is not to set aside, however, the strategies of distancing and displacement so often pursued by the modern sculptural object. Alina Shapoxnikov described her sculptures as, quote, awkward objects or objets maladroits. And the feminist art historian Griselda Pollock has understood much of the artist's work with the body as an expression of encrypted trauma, in her words. For instance, Shapoxnikov's practice of stretching industrial materials like polyester resin around interiors of wool and torn newspaper served to render fragile, gendered human bodies through materials and processes that recalled their annihilation. The sculptor's project for a monument at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which she survived during the Holocaust, shows two disembodied hands that seem to be on the brink of losing their corporeal integrity, cradling an absence. Shapoxnikov's purpose here is not just to call attention to the body's trauma and survival, but to call out for a subject to bear witness. In closing out his essay in the catalogue of the partial figure, Elson said that, quote, modern painting and sculpture remind us of how uncertain a possession is our body. Through post-war practices of abstraction and figuration, minimalism and post-minimalism, that uncertainty would be figured through objects again and again. But in accounting for the diverse and often difficult procedures of modern sculpture here, I've tried to show that it is not only the integrity of our bodies that modernity has repeatedly thrown into question. It is also our position as subjects. Modern sculpture staked out its there-ness with reference to our here-ness, its singularity in relation to our difference. For all its resistance to language, it speaks to the ways in which modern minds and bodies are asked to occupy a modern world. This was never reducible simply to the positions it took within our world, its incorporation of found objects and the contours of everyday life. Modern sculpture's ambition was to capture how the structures of modern experience, its temporality and fragmentariness, its interiority and immediacy, situated us as subjects. What is indispensable to sculpture is that it did all of this both through and in tension with its quiddity, its specificity as an object, its position out there in a space at once indivisible and entirely distinct from our own. It's not incidental that I've circled around this condition, that its terms, out there-ness, otherness, remoteness, essence, autonomy, being in itself, the en soi, never seem to grasp it fully. Modern sculpture was relational. It positioned itself relative to coordinates of our experience, from the floor to the wall to the body. It opened out its closed forms, brought down the monolith, admitted light and space. It referred to us. But these openings were always rooted in a fundamental closure, in a ground that precedes and resists language, that discloses itself and nothing more. Philosophers have continually and repeatedly asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Sartre asked, why is there nothing rather than something? And if modern sculpture had a question, it was this. And their answers, modern sculpture and Sartre, were much the same. Sartre's famous essay on Giacometti, The Search for the Absolute, illustrates this in language that is regrettably gendered, but evokes well that meeting place that sculpture made its own, a space between the muteness of things and our insistence that they speak. I'll read this in closing, quote, "A man raises his arm, a man clenches his fist. Man is the indissoluble unity and the absolute source of his movements. Moreover, he is a symbol charmer. Signs are caught in his hair, shine in his eyes, dance between his lips, fall from his fingertips. He speaks with his whole body. If he runs, he speaks. If he stops, he speaks. If he sleeps, his sleep is worded. Now here is the matter to be formed, a rock, a simple clot of space. With space, then, Giacometti has to make a man. He has to write movement into the total immobility, unity into the infinite multiplicity, the absolute into the purely relative, the future into the eternally present, the chatter of signs into the obstinate silence of things. Thank you.